We're going to start the third panel. If I could have the panelists get ready here and everyone take your seat. Up. Okay, everybody. Ladies and gentlemen, if you would take your seats, please. There's our moderator, Dr. Ornstein, Mr. Ornstein. We're going to start our next panel. If the panelists would come forward. Hi, Tony. I'm going to introduce the moderator. You can read the bios of all the members of the panel in your programs, but I especially want you to know a little bit about the moderator, Norm Ornstein. So let's talk about straight talk. If you haven't read Norm's book, it's an absolutely super book. Talk about straight talk. Came out about a year ago, am I right, Norm?
Paperback just out.
Paperback just out.
Makes a great holiday gift.
Great. And of course, he's talking about the Halloween holiday. So the title of the book is It's Even Worse Than It Looks. And he is talking about the American political system there. And there's a lot of talk about where we are, the politics of extremism, and what there is straight talk. And that's what this conference is about, and this panel as well. And to lead us through it, Norm, as the resident scholar of the American Enterprise Institute, and a highly experienced contributor to the national conversation, political conversation, over a couple of decades, 3 decades now, no, 4 decades. That's experience. So over to you and your panelists. Thanks, Norm.
Thanks, Mary. What a terrific panel we have. And let me just introduce them briefly in order. You have more details, of course, in your program. Victor Zhao is President and CEO of Duke University Health Systems. Tony Coles is President and Chief Executive Officer and Chairman of the Board of Directors at Onyx Pharmaceuticals. And for those of you who don't keep up in the papers, it has been so successful and has such promise that it was a subject of a bidding war and just purchased by Amgen, which is terrific. Francis Collins needs no introduction. Not only for his own path-breaking research, but for his wonderful leadership of the National Institutes of Health. Deborah Lappin is president of the Council for American Medical Innovation and very well known for her active work and advocacy for patients and others in this treacherous world. And Bob Hariri is the founder and chief executive officer of Celgene, another absolutely superb company. I'm particularly excited to have 4 MDs on the panel because I got a little infection and a hair follicle while shaving, and I can have 4 consultations after the panel is over without having to make an appointment.
And I'm a lawyer, so I...
Okay. I wish you hadn't said that. There go my consultations, right down the tubes. I want to start, we're going to do a couple of things on this panel. We're going to talk for a little bit, at least about the set of problems that we have, which leads us into trying to look for solutions, namely how we can develop a much larger force that can make the case more effectively, make it powerfully, and we hope make it unstoppable about the importance to all of us, to the future of the country, to the future of health in the world, that we change the focus and really begin to move forward with the kind of research that is necessary and that is now under such siege. Let me just start with a few opening comments to lay the groundwork. Of course, the challenge that we have starts with our dysfunctional politics, which I believe, after actually 43 years of being immersed here in the politics of Washington from one end of Pennsylvania Avenue to the other, are more dysfunctional than at any time that I've seen it. And Americans know it. We have a new poll out this morning. 95% of Americans say that they will support boots on the ground in Syria as long as those boots are worn by members of Congress. Congress's approval rating is at 8%. John McCain is fond of saying that he and his colleagues are down to blood relatives and paid staff. I know many of McCain's relatives, a little shaky group there as well, so there's room to drop further. There are a couple of points to make about dysfunctional politics, though. One is that it's not just Washington. They are metastasizing out to states, North Carolina among them, and that in turn is creating even bigger challenges and problems for us as we think about what's under siege in terms of continuing to have the groundwork for research. And among other things, if we get these guerrilla wars against the Medicaid expansion, that is going to put, somebody's going to pay for it. It's going to put increasing pressure on community hospitals, on teaching hospitals, on universities more generally, and that's pressure that they don't need right now where they already have other problems. At the same time, we know that dysfunctional politics can breed dysfunctional processes to try and force action where we simply can't get it otherwise. And that's what we have with the sequester, which we often fail to reiterate was designed not to happen. It was designed to be so horrific, so self-destructive, so stupid that no sane person could allow it to happen. There was a logical flaw in that, which is these sane people, but now it has happened. And unfortunately, what has also happened is that because a sequester, and remember we've seen one tranche of this with 9 to go, is not something that has the roof on fire, but has particularly voracious termites eating out the foundation of the society, went unnoticed for a long period of time. And frankly, one of our problems is a mass media that does not focus on much anymore except the immediate problem, that has not covered very effectively what this is doing to a whole series of important areas, and not just basic research, food safety, our ability to deal with epidemics if and when they occur in so many areas, not to mention Homeland Security, national defense, and elsewhere. And we're moving forward with it. But that's not our only problem. We have gone for years now approaching a new fiscal year with no budget, often no appropriations bills, no business, none of your businesses, none others out there could operate for long with people on the ground not having any idea what their budget's going to be for the next year, much less any ability to plan for the future. This year is the worst ever. We are 18 days from the beginning of a new fiscal year. We do not have a single appropriations bill in place. And it is even worse than that because we have a Republican Party right now that is in the midst of its own civil war. An attempt to try and move us past a government shutdown by at least creating a temporary continuing resolution was pulled from the House floor because of a revolt within the party, led by, in particular, by forces in the Senate like Ted Cruz, Rand Paul, and Mike Lee, with their allies in the House, who are demanding a never give up, never surrender. We can use this to blow Obamacare out of the water. And unfortunately, a leadership that now is trying to mollify some of those forces by saying, don't worry, we'll get our way on the debt limit. So this is like Friday the 13th, Part 7, when it applies to the political process. And God knows what chaos we will have that will ensue from that. Now, underlying this as well is a much larger basic hostility towards government that has taken over for a very substantial share of the public. And that means an unfocused hostility towards government. This is not a situation where you can say, we want less government, but we want the government we have to function efficiently and well, And we know there are areas that government has to do because they will not be done effectively by the private sector. That is the fundamental of basic research. It may be that 30 or 40 years ago, we could rely on the Bell Labses of the world, but now, where shareholder value and the next quarter's profits are what drive the business world, there is no market incentive to commit money to something that might not have a payoff for 5, 10, 15, or 20 years, and that payoff may go to somebody else. So it is the government that will have to fund this, and that has been a fundamental in our society that has enabled us to gain such an edge in scientific research, in innovation, that has been our engine for prosperity in a global economy, and that now is close to broken. And then let me add just a couple of other points. One is that this kind of an era with sluggish economic growth as well and political dysfunction that really has become tribal in nature almost invariably generates populism. Populism brings pressure on all institutions and all leaders. And frankly, we have precious few leaders across almost any institution in the society now. Civic society, much less government, with the kind of credibility across the board to be able to create that broad influence. For a pharmaceutical industry, which is always under siege, it makes it even more difficult. And if we are looking for some of these broad partnerships and the kinds of pressures that are there that will make it harder for companies that are not courageous and innovative to move forward and do their own research, they may hunker down, or we can get into another cycle of let's find another scapegoat to take the pressure off of us. That's a part of the challenge that we face. And finally, it's important to note that we are in an era which is a good era in many ways of looking for ways and avenues to cut medical costs for Americans where the burden has become crushing. We're finding some success there. We're finding avenues, and we may, with the Affordable Care Act, find more. But the fact is, as we move forward, both with the Affordable Care Act and with some of those pressures in the private sector, that doesn't necessarily mean that the funds are going to be allocated appropriately, and areas like teaching hospitals that are a seed corn for much of the innovation that we're going to have, if they're underfunded, and as we see other pressures on research, may cause plenty of the best and brightest to look for other avenues, other places to go. Right. So that's the best face I can put on it for the moment. And with that, let's talk a little bit more about some of these challenges and then see if we can come up with ways of overcoming them, because we have one fundamental here that I think is a great asset of ours, and that is the overwhelming majority of Americans want health research. They want breakthroughs. They want innovations. They're important for their daily lives, for themselves, for their loved ones, and for the future. And most recognize, if you can get a focus on it, that spending tax dollars, spending their own dollars on research that can lead to these breakthroughs is good for us in health terms and good for us in economic terms as well. So let me turn first to you, Dr. Collins. As you see it from the inside, as I see it from the outside, one of the real problems here is that with basic grants being 5-year grants, and you get the sequester and the other pressures on the budget, what's going to happen is that new grants are going to be hit the most, and that is going to create a real devastating effect on getting young people moving through the system if they can't rely on those grants to do their research, to go elsewhere. Are you seeing this happen already? And is this at the root of some of the problem that we have?
It's maybe the problem that keeps me awake the most, but there's quite a long list of reasons not to sleep these days when you look at the situation. And Norm, I appreciate your outlining very effectively just how deep a hole we seem to have fallen into and how challenging it's going to be to climb out of it. And I'm glad we're having straight talk at this meeting. And I hope every person in this room will walk out of here with a personal agenda to see what you can do about it. And this won't be just another talking heads experience where everybody goes back to whatever they were doing as if nothing had happened. because I still don't think we've activated our case sufficiently for it to be heard in all the places that it needs to be. Yes, I have this paradoxical experience almost every day of the enormous excitement about science, which is at a position right now of unbelievable promise, whether you're talking about cancer or brain diseases or diabetes or infectious conditions. We are rocketing forward at a pace I would not have imagined 10 years ago. But the most critical resource to make that happen is actually not, technologies and instruments and supplies. It's people. And the people are demoralized, and particularly the young scientists are seriously questioning, is it time to do something else? If you have not seen it, look at the survey just issued by ASBMB, which looked at 3,000 scientists, asking them, what has sequester done to your experience? And here again, I get very inflamed when I see reports saying, well, the sequester didn't make any difference. Well, come and spend a day with me, and I'll show you what kind of difference it has made in the lives of people who are trying to pursue this noble enterprise. That survey pointed out that something like 55% of people they asked knew of a colleague who had lost their job because of sequester. Something like 80% of the people they asked said they were now spending a much larger proportion of their time just writing and rewriting and resubmitting and trying to get a grant funded because the pay line has fallen so far that your chances are so low. And so instead of doing research, you're just writing and resubmitting and going nowhere. And maybe scariest of all, in that survey, 18% of the people who were asked about their future said they were looking at the possibility of a job in another country because they saw the American enterprise, the American dream, as so potentially under threat that they might be better off to take their career to other countries who, frankly, are not following that same trajectory. They looked at the American success story over the last 50 years. They're trying to be us just at the time we'd forgotten how to be us. Look at China, look at India, look at South Korea, look at Singapore, look at Brazil. I mean, I could go on. All of these are places that are rocketing upwards in their support for science, even as we are losing ground. And of course, the sequester hit us not just at a point where things were going well. We had, over the last 10 years, lost progressively to inflation, about 20% of our purchasing power. That then goes down to 25% below where we were because of this $1.5 billion that went out the window last March. And as you said, it ain't over. I think some people think, well, we weathered it, we're still here, I guess we'll just be okay now. We're not going to be okay. Even if the Congress passes a continuing resolution at the 13 level, we will lose another $600 million to the budget on October 1st. And most people did not realize that. And that's several hundred more grants. We already, by tallying it up, will not fund about 650 grants that were highly scored, were in the top 17%, and are not going to get funded because specifically of sequester. So don't tell me there has not been a consequence. Talk to those 650 applicants who thought they were going to get funded because they got a great review, and yet the answer is still going to be no. 150 of those are actually people who are coming back for a competing renewal. That is, they'd already been doing research in a very important area. They were highly productive. They have new great ideas. They must have had all of that or they would not have scored in the top 17%, and they're going to be cut off. So that's a double tragedy. We're losing what they proposed, and we're losing what they'd already invested, what we'd already invested in as well. Gone. Which of those would have been the next breakthrough in cancer? Which of those investigators would have been the Nobel Prize winner we would celebrate in 20 years? We'll never know. And for us to sit in a room like this and basically say, well, it's the way politics goes, it's just unacceptable. If we really believe that this is a noble enterprise, that we're engaged in something that is as important as the health of you and your family and of the rest of the nation, and if it's the way we're going to pull our economy back out of some difficult spots, which the evidence is very strong for, we should be making a lot of noise. So make noise, people. I'm making noise. Come along, help me out here.
Okay, we may not know which of those would be the major breakthroughs, but one thing is certain. There would have been breakthroughs that would have saved lives, alleviated suffering, and probably meant trillions of dollars for the economy for a price of, in the larger context, a trivial amount. So that's a part of the tragedy. Now, let's look beyond that. And Victor, let me ask you, looking at it from the perspective of a university, and it's a private university, and you've got certainly a healthy endowment. It's one of the most successful. What kinds of pressures are you feeling, and how much of this is coming from what are both indirect and direct pressures from state government, from the federal government, and what from the larger problems in the society as we clamp down on costs?
Thank you. First of all, let me say that Francis, you took the ball and got it rolling. It's great. I'm competing with you how many hours we sleep each night. Because I have the same kind of headache, except it's much closer to the ground. I run one of the most successful academic health centers. I'm the chancellor of the university, and I live this every day, what Francis is talking about. We are coming off a great year with the Nobel Prize on one hand and just Alaska on the other. They were federally supported research years ago. And the impact of those two discoveries, one, receptors that account for about 1,000 drugs that you make and others that save lives, and cochlear implant that helps you to hear, is phenomenal. And so when we think about, I completely agree with Francis, the best thing we have is people, and the best thing university can do is innovation. The problem right now is our environment is not fully supportive of that. We have great people who work so hard, and just want to amplify some of the things that Franz talked about. Students, young people. I just look at our number. We have to contract our graduate student body by some 13% because of funding issues. And you read the Huffington Post, one of our postdocs, Alison Myers, was interviewed, and she said, I entered research 10 years ago because it was so exciting to do cancer work. Graduate school, postdoc, now she can't find a job. And more importantly, perhaps, is the kind of brain drain things that you worry about. Reverse brain drain. So one of my friends in one of the Ivy League school, my counterparts, saying they can't retain the assistant professors who, in fact, came from other countries, successfully gotten a K-99. But they say, there's more money in China. I get more opportunity in China. I came to this country 40 years ago. I'm an immigrant. As 40 years ago, I went to first Canada, then I saw this tremendous opportunity in the United States, great enthusiasm, excitement, and it's been treated me really well. When I talk to people like me now, when I was 40 years ago, I don't think that level of excitement, that level of great expectation from this country is there. So I'm really worried about that. And then if you put on top of that our faculty, who's working really hard, many of them are, in fact, in the category of trying to rewrite the grants and write the grants. They find they spend more time writing grants than doing the research, which is absolutely needed. Now, you asked me about what are the pressures. I have a paper, an article today in New England Journal of Medicine that says, academic center preparing for an uncertain future. And we are really seeing the perfect storm. Because on one hand, you're looking at the need to transform care delivery altogether. And the other side will be sequestration. Now, so as you begin to do things differently, and I think that, in fact, the Affordable Care Act is taking us in the right direction, but a lot of uncertainties. We have to take tremendous amount of cost out. We're undergoing a cost reduction initiative for the next 2 years, take hundreds of millions of dollars out of our fundamental costs in order to be more competitive and being able to deliver care according to what we should be doing, low cost. Sequestration on the other side. So I think the whole system is feeling that although we have great assets, we may not be able to get the right support to get it there. So most of my peers, and there are many of them in this room, are spending more time thinking about how we redo things, how we adjust size and the whole bit, but rather than thinking about how do we increase innovation, how do we move things forward. And you mentioned about the state. As you can imagine, we take care of lots of patients in terms of uninsured and Medicaid. And of course, the state budget is under siege. And our state decided not to expand Medicaid, probably bring HMOs. And you can imagine that's going to be another factor. And I can go on and on. Suffice to say, I totally agree with Francis. It's time that we really make a lot of noise, try to make it differently, because what's great about this country is innovation and the people that we have. If, in fact, they get discouraged, they don't get the support, I would think that we're going to be a very different place Final point. As you know, we're the place, academic centers, that train people, nurses, physicians, that train scientists. We're the place that do research and care. And if you don't look at how to support, enable these gem, if I will, jewels of the place, I think we will see the earlier panel about 50 years from now would look like. I think we're not going to be quite as good as what we have been. Research America, I think, did a survey, and 60% of Americans says by 2020, they expect us to actually not as competitive as some of the other countries. That's amazing. That's 5 years from now that people think we're losing our competitiveness. So I can go on like Francis, but I would say I want to give you some examples of what I'm experiencing.
That's terrific. Now, Tony and Bob, you run very successful pharmaceutical companies that have done a lot of research and cutting-edge research. Talk a little bit about how much the NIH work and the basic research done by government undergirds what you do. What if it went away? Would you still be able to do breakthrough drugs, and would the vacuum be filled?
So I'd argue absolutely not. And so there's an instant answer there. And part of these discussions is the purpose is to provoke and stimulate thought. But like Victor, let me provide a couple of examples. I want to go back to the ecosystem conversation we were having in the very first panel.
Yes.
Very few people recognize, people in this room of course, but very people outside of these circles recognize that this is an ecosystem that consists of, if you will, the top of the funnel at the NIH, which does the basic biological research that a company like ours or Bob's could never do. We can't scale it, we can't afford it actually. So we count on the NIH to fund the academy so that we can then take the learnings from the academy and translate those into new therapies and innovations that we can bring to patients. So that's the funnel end of it. Look at the later part of that, if you will, and if our companies span that bridge, there's the FDA portion of that specifically provides a gating mechanism for those new innovations and those new therapies out to patients. Then, of course, you have the final translation, which is the administration of care. But think about the multiple points in this value chain or delivery chain that have been impacted by the conversation we're having today. The moment of innovation at the earliest end at the Academy and the NIH, the point of regulatory review and passage of these new therapies to patients, and then the final portion, which is the delivery of care. And why is that? And I'm pondering this because we sit in this room, it's so logical to us, not just for the beauty of innovation and the advancement of science and knowledge, but there's a practical understanding in terms of our competitive leadership and the economic power that the life science industry itself brings to us from a GDP perspective. Why? Well, I don't know that I know the answer, but I do know that we haven't had the conversations on both sides of the aisle. And without attributing blame or credit on either side based on political dogma, I know we're not having the right conversation. Because we've now taken something that's so fundamental to humanity, which is the basic unlocking of the mechanisms of the body and of disease, and we've politicized it. We've made it yet another political football, which tells me that we really are not having the right conversations. I spent this morning on the Hill talking to two distinguished members of Congress about this very topic. And when I raise it, believe it or not, and it's possible to believe, they shrug their shoulders. Not for lack of interest, but because of the total sense of a lack of empowerment to move this from the political football it's become to a real matter of national importance. So somehow we're not having the right conversation. Take one of our lead therapies, Nexavar, for liver and kidney cancer, and now under review for thyroid cancer, supported by 41 NIH grants. Now I can tell you that if those 41 NIH grants had not existed in the 1990s, Nexavar would not be preserving lives and extending life around the world. Our latest therapy, Kyprolis, for the treatment of multiple myeloma, 8 NIH grants. Again, very clear evidence that this wide part of the funnel has been so critical and so important. So how is it that we can disconnect the politicization of this conversation and really get focused on the essence that it provides, both for the betterment of society, but more importantly, for the global economic power that this industry brings to this country? It's a simple elegant and beautiful argument and one of the best value-creating industries in the world. And it should be that simple and that transparent for everyone that's 6 blocks away.
Bob?
Yeah, I think Tony really expressed the importance of the role the NIH plays in helping to catalyze but also drive the processes that occur in industry. But I can say that from this morning's panel, when Commissioner Hamburg described our ecosystem, I mean, I see this truly as a community. And as a community, I don't think we've been as effective at communicating together in a unified way, because the benefactors of what we do are the community at large. Clearly, there'll be the stakeholders who are putting their speculative dollars behind the development that occurs in industry. But the reality is, we have allowed the politicization of this topic because there's been controversy or divide within this community. And I think that if we identify the virtuous cycle that exists when you invest in medical innovation, that upon the commitment of intellectual capital and financial resources to pursuing a grand challenge like controlling a hematologic malignancy, there's the Bernoulli's law actually plays a role here. That the faster we innovate, the more lift we create for the entire community. I've been delighted at how receptive and helpful the agency, the FDA, has been in this disruptive technology of cell therapy. Very engaging. Thank you very much, because we have truly benefited from this dialogue, and we see ourselves in a lot of ways as a partnership. I think that industry and NIH can advance their partnership dramatically, and the public will, I believe, see this as not only new ways to treat disease, improve lifespan, but also greater opportunity to improve the GDP as we not only do we extend life, but we're extending the useful life of recipients of these therapies. And they contribute effectively to our gross domestic product. We then provide an increase in the number of jobs in our sector. So I think that communication is essential, and as a community, we have to find a way to communicate together.
Deborah, this is a good point for a pivot now. What do we do about all of this? How do we move this?
Took the thought right out
yes.
of my head.
And you're our only hope.
I know, I was sensing that. And I don't mean to say that the case has been made, that medical innovation is an integrated ecosystem, it's a virtuous cycle. The case has been made that China's eating us for lunch with $305 billion they're going to spend over the next 5 years. George Will writes, we wrote the playbook, and the rest of the year. So I like what we're saying, but I think where we land is, what do we do next? And in looking at the voices on the panel, from industry to academia to government to patient advocacy, I would argue that probably the one today that's got to rise to the top of the chorus, and it's a chorus, not a Gregorian chant. We have different harmonic lines in what we sing to the same hymnal. But the one that needs to rise to the top is this era and age of patient centricity, and we are in it. I almost felt like I wanted to say thank you for including me on the panel as a voice of the patient, and when I thought about those words, I realized those were words of 1992, when I landed on an NIH advisory council, and I was grateful as a patient to be there. Today, I shouldn't be grateful to be at the table. I should know that the voice that I represent is the voice that is setting the table and is getting ready to design the menu. And we need to know that this is the power of the current age if we're going to change Congress. Two things. One, I think the patients have to be united and leading. Maybe there are three things. Two, I think the patients have to be part of a tough love conversation. In a time of economic constraints, we are going to have the conversation about how we set disease priorities for research. Tough conversation, but we can't go away from it. And third, we have to tie it to economic return. And Tom Frieden was right. The Senate, in giving $100 million to the NIA, tied it in their report language to the fact that Alzheimer's is going to cost this country so much that we're going to break out of our locked arms, will not set disease priorities, and we're going to say, something needs to be done. Well, $100 million, and Francis has already done everything he can with limited authorities to look at a public health crisis, but his hands are tied. So we have to decide what this conversation looks like to give the power to the patient voice, tie it to economic returns, and be leading the tough conversation so people understand that we get it and we're part of a force for change. And then you think about American public and the tax dollars. Would there be something like a campaign? My tax dollars, our tax dollars, our health, our lives, something where we did be bold enough to test this out and see if it would even hold water.
You mentioned George Will, who did argue eloquently that we had written the playbook and others were taking it over. But George Will, before that, ridiculed the sequester, this pitiful amount of money, and everybody's crying about it, which reflects, I think, some of the larger pathology that we have in this conversation, because we're not making distinctions, and particularly about cost-effective use of taxpayer money. Let me throw out a couple of ideas and just see how you all react to them. One is that we shoot for the moon for something different, and that is, let's get an endowment for medical research. Let's find a way with dedicated revenues in a country where people are willing to pay a little bit more, and not to replace perhaps the annual appropriations or with some congressional control over it, but to provide a base and maybe focus some of our efforts not just on changing the dialogue to get people aware of where we're eating ourselves alive, but to turn in a positive direction. The second is whether the BRAIN initiative is something that ought to be replicated in other areas. And the danger of that, of course, is that you then begin to pick and choose and silo research, which is not a very great idea. But it might also mobilize in a way where you can actually have people, instead of talking about how we're going to cut government, explain why we're not going to fund research on something that is a pernicious disease. So I'll just open it up, and what do you think of those ideas or others that might emerge?
Well, let me jump in, because I love this notion. So Eleanor in her moderating of the first panel talked about the public-private partnership approaches. And we've been pioneering those at Onyx and have done them with UCSF and MD Anderson. There's a clear role for that kind of thing, but Norm, I think it's as a stopgap or as a complementary expansion effort, not a replacement. Because ultimately, if we look forward to the next 10 or 15 or 20 years, to the extent that we would rely solely on public-private partnerships as a stopgap, we'll be missing an important investment opportunity as a country. So I go back to your opening introductory comment, there are just some things government has to hold the responsibility for.
Yeah. I'd like to push this public-private partnership a little further. I think that what Onyx does and what others do are very impressive, but not sufficient. I think the real way to go forward, in my opinion, is to form a true public-private partnership that has government, industry, patients, and academia together. You know, I read the RISE 2 report from the American Academy of Arts and Science, and they talked about the fact that back in World War II, there was just, people have seen this phenomenal collaboration between all the sectors because we have a national priority. And if you think about the moonshot or Apollo, there's tremendous collaboration in the country because there's national priority. If we establish it as a national priority, I think I agree with you that we need to continue funding of the government, but people, when they come together and willing to put skin in the game together and create something much larger. The question, your point about is a BRAIN initiative, whatever, I think that's to be determined as our national priority. What areas do we want to work on? And that, for instance, is not to replace what we do every day in investigative-initiated research, but I think if the sectors come together to say, let's put our best mind, our money together, and really take some of the biggest topic together, I think that can make a huge difference. They already started doing that in Europe. I understand that there's a Innovative Medicine Institute where multiple companies and institutions are putting their dollars together. I just wonder why it's not to replace what you said about the trust fund, but I still say that while we're on the topic of public-private partnership, we can do a lot more together. And I would challenge our colleagues from industry to say, step up. And I'll bet you that Francis and the government and certainly me and academics say, if you're going after Alzheimer's, I will put in my best scientists into the project, alongside with the funding and the opportunity to work together, like the moonshot. And if people are worried about what happens to intellectual property, think about what happened in moonshot. There are hundreds of companies spun out of this, and people can put their resources together to make a difference.
And I think that Victor makes a tremendous point, and I think that we also need, as a community, to embrace the inherent riskiness of any disruptive transformational technology that will change the paradigm in a disease like Alzheimer's. There's no guaranteed payoff. At Celgene, we've a good example, our cell therapy business was a very risky undertaking. Celgene invested in this a decade before it really rose to the attention of big pharma. But with the uncertainty, we've embraced that riskiness, and it's created tremendous opportunity as well, including the advent of cellular immunotherapeutics for cancer, which now are far more relevant to what Celgene does than what we originally started with. So I just think that that's also another element of this.
Francis, you'll have the final word on this, and then we have to open it up for questions.
I think there are 3 points on the
Deborah,
table.
the first question.
3 points on the table, quick response. First of all, the public-private partnership. We must be investing in these innovative ideas about how to work together between government agencies, FDA, NIH, working more closely than in history. Likewise, the way in which FDA is working with other agencies. We're working with CMS. All of that is just critical. And working between public and private, we have an initiative to do target validation that is truly groundbreaking if it gets off the ground in the next month or so, focused on Alzheimer's disease, diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis. Really, as you said, bringing together the top scientists from both sectors to see what could we do together to identify the right targets for the next generation of drug development. This would be quite radical, and I think it is a fair chance it's going to come to pass. So those are all good things. But I think, Norm, you were asking also about other sources of support, like a trust fund. And Tom Harkin, goodness, 20 years ago, was raising this as a possibility, whether this could be a checkoff on your health care plan, give $1 to research. That could add up to a lot of money. Various ideas were floated. Maybe it would be from tobacco. None of them actually quite came to pass. There is an increasing sort of attention to those kinds of models once again popping up, and you can hear even people you wouldn't expect, Eric Cantor, talking about how maybe we could utilize some of the dollars that have been collected when you check on your income tax that you would like to give money to research, to presidential campaigns. Those money could actually go to research, a small amount of money, but it's the idea. So maybe there's something there to explore. The danger, of course, is that it becomes a reason for the appropriations to have a subtraction that exactly matches whatever that trust fund had raised, and that makes everybody quite nervous, and understandably so. Final thing, in terms of the BRAIN initiative, this is this new effort, which is a joint effort between NIH and NSF and DARPA and a bunch of private foundations, as well as industry substantially interested. This is an acronym that stands for Brain Research through Advancing Innovative Neurotechnologies, basically trying to figure out how do those circuits in the brain actually work. We don't know. How in real time do you do something as complicated as moving your hand or laying down a memory and retrieving it when you need to? If we had that foundation of information, all of our work on Alzheimer's and autism and epilepsy and traumatic brain injury would be so far advanced. Schizophrenia, my gosh, we so need to know this stuff. And you have this sense, if you're watching this field, that the time is right to pull together disciplines that haven't quite connected yet, stimulate some new technologies, and really begin to lay open answers to questions that otherwise were not possible. Now, maybe people will say, well, then you're favoring neuroscience. Well, neuroscience is a pretty big deal. And it is also scientific opportunity. It has the same feel as the Genome Project in 1990, although we shouldn't underestimate how hard it's going to be. But the worst thing we could do, I think, if we are interested in biomedical research, is to hunker down and not put forward something that is pretty gee whiz, innovative, take your breath away. Wow, you could do that. And I think that's what the BRAIN Initiative aims to do. It's inspiring. It is groundbreaking. It is a way to activate interest and excitement and not make it just sound as if, well, we just want more money because we're so good at what we do. We actually have some identifiable, novel ideas that could be quite transformative.
Great. Let's open it up to a couple of questions, and we'll let Deborah have the last word here, too. So.
Can I do that
Well,
now?
go ahead, yes.
Let me just, because I want to follow up on what Francis said. We have to do something disruptive here. We understand that the basic research engine is a primary role of government. But if we don't match that in this new economy with private sector funds that are able to come to the basic research table in a new way, we will be missing an opportunity. There are new opportunities for social impact financing. There is high net worth that's being untapped for basic medical research and for translational. I think this enterprise would have to do, Francis, something similar to your target validation consortium, which is just brilliant because it's saying we're going to unlock what's here and move it quickly into human trials, but have a better understanding of the risk going into those trials. If we can communicate that, people will understand how that translation that changed my life from somebody who was disabled now gets to run a health and life sciences practice because of that translational paradigm. People that will get that. The final point is we have to have industry coming up to the table to say that what happens at the NIH and our federal funding is critical to what they do. And it began this morning with Bart, but it's not enough to have it in this room. That message has to be loud and clear and said by industry in their own discussions.
We have time for one question.
Norm, I was on the Hill this morning, there are very few members of Congress who don't say that because of Dr. Collins's efforts, they all agree with it. And patient groups, they go to the members of Congress, everybody always agrees with the patient groups. But because we don't have regular order, nobody has to vote or show any ability, and every member of Congress say, but I can't do anything. How do we return that, and how do patient groups and those of us in the room change the fact that regular order in Congress isn't there?
That's the biggest problem that well, there are two problems we have in this process. The biggest problem that we have is this is a tribal atmosphere, and it's become almost like the former Yugoslavia in our politics. And we lose sight of any of the priorities. There's no debate, no deliberation, and no setting of priorities. And the anti-government fervor is let's cut, except when you get to specifics. And that's the Eric Cantor phenomenon. Well, we didn't mean pediatric research. We meant everything else. Well, we didn't mean the FDA. We meant everything else. But they can avoid it, and they avoid it as long as they possibly can. And I think we're going to have to devote some time and effort to pushing people into realizing that the votes that they're taking actually are cutting some of these things that most Americans also want but don't believe is a part of government. They're saying cut government without realizing what government is. And we're going to have to change that dialogue. And that also, I think, is going to involve some buy-in from the business community, from every health industry. We have to make sure as we move forward with the Affordable Care Act that we don't get tribalism within this community, whereas, people are fighting for dollars, and it's very easy to attack others in the process, for hospitals to attack doctors, for doctors to attack pharmaceutical companies and the like. We've got to change that phenomenon as well. But I must tell you that I don't have a lot of optimism in the short run. I'll use another analogy. If you ever read the book or saw the movie The War of the Roses, that's what we're in now in our politics. It's far more about destroying the other side or imposing a particular vision without realizing that we're destroying everybody along the way. How do you break out of that? In the short run, we're not going to break out of that. But even in the short run, we have had so many forces in the society who have been absent without leave when it comes to these larger debates. Why isn't 60 Minutes, speaking of CBS, doing a piece every week on an area of government that is being devastated by the sequester and this craziness in the appropriations process that's hurting all of us? Why are we not seeing a business community, when it comes to this insanity over government shutdowns and a breach in the debt limit, stepping forward and saying, stop this madness? It's not happening, and it's not happening in this area where all of the forces are coming together in the way we need it to. And that's, I think, a part of the task that Research America has taken on, and it's why it's so valuable. And clearly, I think we go back to what Francis said in his early comments. Every one of us ought to leave this room thinking, what can we do? Or how can we change this dialogue or somehow change this dynamic? And finally, let me say, there's an absence of leadership in all institutions, but it's particularly acute at the political level. And I think that's true in the executive branch. It's more true in the legislative branch. And whether it's, and that's true in both parties, even though this polarization is asymmetric. I don't want to lose sight of that reality. It's not everybody's fault. We have this is not John Porter's Republican Party. This is not a party that's focused on problem solving, not a party that's focused on, well, we want a smaller government, but where are we going to put our resources and our priorities? It is throw the bombs and let them go off where they may. And yet, I don't see anybody stepping up to making the hard choices about bringing back some degree of debate and deliberation. So how we bypass that becomes another part of our challenge. And with that, I think we turn it over to Mary for the final comments. Thanks.
Well, I think you'll agree with me that we've been hearing some straight talk. And the challenge, as given to us by Dr. Collins, by Norm Ornstein, everybody on all of our panels in one way or another, is to do something about it. To just not talk among ourselves or further fine-tune the diagnosis. We know what's going on. So now's the time to pick up the challenge and to add some disruptive advocacy, if you will, to disruptive innovation, so we can be sure that we do get to the solutions. And we will, if we all work together, speak with one voice together, determined to be active, be optimistic, but also be realistic. Because if we don't do the next round of effective advocacy, we will all be sick and broke in the next 10 years or the next 50. We heard so much today from being at a crisis a few years ago to now really being at a crossroads. I've so much like that metaphor. We are at a crossroads, I think, in this nation as to where we're going and to the part of it that we all own and embrace, which is getting to a healthier nation. But it's going to take everybody working together. I can assure you that that's what Research America is going to be doing, including via discussions that our board is going to be having later today and tomorrow to determine what we're going to do and what we're going to recommend to our large membership. Many of you are sitting here in this room, and to everybody we can touch, to take this conversation over the heads of the Congress to the American public so that that Congress will listen and so that they'll be held accountable for all of our future health and for the research and innovation that'll take us there. I don't want to close this out today without thanking, first of all, everyone who participated on a panel and as moderators. Thank you all so much. Thank you to Lily for your generosity as our lead sponsor. And thank you to all of our sponsors, to Colgate-Palmolive, to Celgene, to Onyx, to J&J and Genentech and the AMA, and Politico and The Hill and WebMD and Northeast Ohio Medical University and Duke and the University of Maryland. We thank you all, and we thank everybody who came. Please stay connected to us. We will stay connected to you. You can revisit all or bits of this conversation today on the web, via WebMD, via social media, and we will be getting back to you, to everybody who came, and to all of our membership with our ideas about where we go next. Thanks so much for coming.